Good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History, and I am introducing a new channel today dedicated specifically to telling the stories of treachery that began in the 19th century, resulting in treason in the 20th century, specifically with the five assassinations in the 60s, four here domestically. And so the name of this channel is Treachery Begets Treason. And in contrast to some of my other uh, content, which is can go on and be much longer and more detailed, I'm going to keep each one of these videos, each one of these episodes short, 30 minutes or less. And each one is going to be a small story that adds to the uh, overall uh, understanding of how this cabal of people crossed the Rubicon from small deceptions and a little bit more major deceptions into actual treason, deceptions against the American people, transitioning into treason against the United States of America. Sir John Harrington was quoted as saying, "Treason doth not prosper. What's the reason? For if it prospers, none dare call it treason." Essentially, what Harrington was saying was if the so-called treasonous behavior or actions succeed, they're never going to be called a traitor because they will be in power. If it fails, they'll be hanging from a noose somewhere. And it's interesting. In my 28 years of teaching history to high school students, uh, one thing I've learned is that not all treason is created equal. uh, the example in the Revolutionary War for, Nathan Hale, for example. Nathan Hale, in the eyes of King George, was a traitor. Of course, so was George Washington. So were all the Revolutionary War soldiers. But specifically, the story of Nathan Hale, I remember when I was a little kid, I read that little book about Nathan Hale being caught by the British soldiers and saying for his last words, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. And then he was hung as a traitor. King George and England viewed him as a traitor. That's how they treated traitors. But the Americans viewed him as a hero. He was a patriot for the cause. And when I read that book, he was a hero in my eyes. Now, contrast that with another Revolutionary War personality, Benedict Arnold, who sold out America to Britain, thus was considered a traitor by the Americans, thinking he would be viewed as a hero by the British, but he wasn't, because they said to themselves, if this man will sell out his own country, he can't be trusted. And so, later in life, he was extremely disillusioned to find out that his actions really didn't gain him all he thought it was going to gain him. He was considered a traitor by both sides. So, and I could go on and on. It happened in the Civil War. It's happened many, many different times, but not all treason is considered equal. For the purposes of this channel, I want to differentiate by definition what the difference, compare and contrast the difference between treason and treachery. Treachery is defined as a betrayal of trust, deceptive actions, a series of deceptive actions. Uh, and that's and that's usually against people or against institutions, etc., etc. Treason, however, is considered a crime of betraying one's country, especially by attempting to kill the sovereign, i.e., the king, or in our case, the president, or overthrow the government, which, of course, in some cases, uh, if you kill the king or kill the president, you, in essence, also overthrow the government simultaneously, killing two birds with one stone. So that is going to be the point of this channel. We're going to start off in the 19th century, right after the Civil War, and introduce a series of stories or actions that took place that were treacherous. Treacherous to the American people, treacherous to the business community, treacherous even towards the government, and intentionally so, but they weren't treasonous. Somewhere we crossed the Rubicon, or these people that started off acting treacherously crossed the Rubicon, uh, passing a point of no return and entering into the arena of treason. And so we're going to focus on all of those actions and those stories, and we're going to focus especially on that Rubicon moment and what it has meant for the United States going forward. It happened pretty quick after the treachery started. It's an interesting phenomena, the slippery slope phenomena, where you get on a slippery slope and you think you can balance, you think you can maintain, you think you can uh, uh, keep your course and stay out of danger. But a slippery slope is just that, it's slippery. And once you make one small compromise and you rationalize one time why treachery is okay, it's not as big a leap to then take the next step and the next step and the next step. And you look back after a few years, wonder how you got there and how we as a nation got there and how this cabal got there that was started off acting in their own self-interest, trying to make money. Uh, and it's interesting how it almost always comes back to money. But they started off acting in their own self-interest and acting treacherously, deceptively, and ended up acting treasonously and doing terrible things, crimes against the country. So it's interesting how I sort of got into this. Um, the I started off studying the assassinations in the 60s. And of course, that was a quite a dramatic period, and not just here domestically, because the CIA was responsible for the Diem brothers assassinations, plural, in Vietnam in 1962. And then a year later, uh, in 1963, the assassination of JFK. And then Malcolm X in 65, and then Martin Luther King in 68, and Robert Kennedy in 68, then Fred Hampton in 69. And in my study of these assassinations, I started to notice a trend. Whereas if you pulled one thread in one of these cases, it connected to all the other cases. And it was, generally speaking, the same people, the same institutions, the same motives, um, and they used the same methods and sources. And it became obvious to me in my study of those 60s assassinations, there was a cabal acting behind the scenes, carrying out policy, but they were unelected and they were certainly unaccountable. And they seemed to always get away with it. And that kind of power is uh, that is greater than what you can achieve as an elected official, where uh, everything you do is accountable, at least in theory, to the people. These people were completely unaccountable, and they made sure it stayed that way. And by the technical definition of treason, when you assassinate a president, you've committed treason. When you overthrow his government, you have committed treason. Now, not all of these people that I named in these assassinations were presidents or kings, but the Diem brothers were in charge in Vietnam until they weren't. JFK was the president of the United States until he wasn't. RFK was fixing to be the president of the United States. He would have beaten Nixon in that election uh, until he couldn't. And then you have civil rights leaders who, according to their own documents, from J. Edgar Hoover, for example, he was afraid that Martin Luther King or Malcolm X might become a black Jesus, a black Moses, somebody who could ascend and uh, transcend being a civil rights leader to becoming a human rights icon, to becoming a leader of not just uh, black people, but also white people, and potentially our first black president. And so you could make a case that all of these folks that I named, with the exception of Fred Hampton, all of these other folks were in the position or actually were presidents or leaders of their countries. They were certainly leaders of movements and on the course to possibly becoming a president and until they were taken out. And the cabal that I have detected in all of these assassinations. Now, understand this is over 30 years of research. I I started off in college researching Watergate, and pretty quickly understood that I was never going to be able to get to the bottom of Watergate unless I went back and studied the JFK assassination. There's so many connections between the two, and the outcomes were the same. And so it, what started off as an investigation of Watergate pretty quickly turned into an investigation of JFK assassination. And what I discovered was, they always say, look for motive, means, opportunity when you're playing detective and trying to determine who you're trying to solve a crime. And the motive, the means, the opportunity in the JFK assassination, for example, involved some pretty important players, all of which had motive, all of which had means, and all of which had opportunity to want to get rid of JFK. Included in this list of characters or in this cabal would be the intelligence agencies like the CIA, the FBI, Office of Naval Intelligence, Army Intelligence, etc. Included in this cabal would be the military, the Joint Chiefs, who couldn't stand JFK, thought he was weak against communism. It included certain politicians like LBJ, who had a choice to make. If JFK was not removed, LBJ was fixing to be indicted, and he would never achieve his dream of being president. He would end up in jail. By contrast, the cabal include big business like Big Oil, who survived on military endeavors such as warfare, feeding the machinery with their oil, with their product, with their commodity, needing a Vietnam War to actualize a lot of profits. The military-industrial complex, all of these weapons manufacturers, et cetera, that Dwight Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address. They had motive, they had means, they had opportunity because JFK was becoming an impediment to their desire for war, specifically the Vietnam War. How about organized crime? Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante, Sam Giancana, Jimmy Hoffa. You say, well, Jimmy Hoffa was leader of the Teamsters Union. He's not organized crime. Organized labor and organized crime are two heads of the same coin, 60s. Yeah, they were both working together to build Las Vegas. And so Jimmy Hoffa was very much involved. Meyer Lansky, the mob accountant. These folks were all part of this cabal that had motive, means, and opportunity. And of course, we'll get into all that motive and means and opportunity. But how about the anti-Castro Cubans down in Florida, specifically in Miami and New Orleans and Dallas, who initially viewed JFK as somebody who's going to ally himself with their cause, but in 3 years of being president, had resisted the urge to go to war against Fidel Castro in the Bay of Pigs, and resisted again during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and indeed by 63 was making efforts of rapprochement to reach across the divide and find a peaceful solution to coexist with Fidel Castro, not to overthrow him, but to actually officially recognize his government. They viewed that as the ultimate betrayal. How about the Secret Service? There's an old saying, the Praetorian Guard, which is what the Romans call it, will protect the king as long as it agrees with the king. And in my study of the Secret Service, JFK assassination, I discovered that the Secret Service, especially the head honchos, did not agree with JFK, specifically his efforts to assist in the civil rights campaign. So you start putting all of these groups and individuals together, and it forms what I call a treasonous cabal. I wrote a book called The Treasonous Cabal, and it takes into account all of these different moving parts. They all had their own motives. And they were separate from one another, but their overall goal was the same. Uh, and what I hope to do through this channel is to show or demonstrate, build a case where it wasn't just JFK who became an impediment to this treasonous cabal. It wasn't just Malcolm X. It wasn't just Martin Luther King. It wasn't just RFK. It wasn't just Fred Hampton. It wasn't just the DM brothers. There's a whole, our whole understanding of history has to change when we realize that there is this deep state, this unaccountable deep state. A lot of people use that term, that is really calling the shots. And if the face of American leadership, in other words, the elected leaders, don't go along, there are punishments, there's accountability, and it's to this deep state. I would include Richard Nixon in that list. He was not assassinated, but he was overthrown, and by this same cabal. Again, it requires a complete uh, re you know, reinvestigation of history, because we've been taught that Nixon was not overthrown. He was corrupt, and Watergate forced him out. It was by his own actions, and that would be a nice, easy thing to believe, wouldn't it? Just like it's easy to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Just like it's easy to believe that James Earl Ray acted alone. Just like it's easy to believe Sirhan acted alone. Those are the easy solutions. You can chalk it up to a lone nut. It's more complicated. It's requires more of us to believe that there's actually a conspiracy, an acting conspiracy that continues to this day, that has been responsible for these events. And it makes you question whether or not these elections are legitimate, whether or not your leaders are really the leaders that you thought they were, whether or not the people exercise popular sovereignty in America, or this unaccountable group is sovereign. Who's in charge? It really makes you re-examine everything you've learned about history. So that's kind of how I got into this study. And so, as I said, as far as time period is concerned, we're going to begin right after the Civil War. And because context is important, and you need to know, we all need to understand how this cabal came to be. What was the motive behind it? Uh, history builds, right? You don't go from A to Z overnight. So the question is, how did this start? What were the building blocks? And what was the Rubicon moment where it transcended treachery and became treason? So we'll spring forward from the post-Civil War, about the 1860s, into the 20th century, in the 1960s and 1970s, about 100, 110 years. And that's the period we're going to look at specifically. And then my hope is, if I do my job well enough and I present this in a chronological, easy to understand manner, you could start to pick out the pattern. You can start to pick out the template that is used over and over and over and over again. And you could recognize it, create a filter in your own mind for current events. This is what's happened with me. I now have a filter through which I absorb any new information, news. And it goes through this filter of all this information, this history that I've learned and researched, and it helps me understand what's really happening. And am I the victim of a psyop? Am I being force-fed a narrative that the government wants or the media wants? Or is there something more behind this story? And it's taught me to look for certain cues. It's taught me to look for certain people or certain fingerprints of institutions. And once you learn to do that, you're not their fool anymore. And you become wise to their ways. And it's an eye-opening experience. So for example, the Spanish-American War, and we were all taught that Spain, was in Cuba, mistreating the Cubans, part of its colony, mistreating the Filipinos as another one of its colonies, and we intervened to help these poor Cubans, these poor Filipinos. That's what we were taught, and that what was the precipitating event, the Spanish-American Wars, when the Spanish sank the United States Maine off the coast of Cuba, which we had sent over there to offload or to onboard American citizens who were living in Cuba to get them out of harm's way. And when they sank our ship, that was the Rubicon moment. That was the point of no return that led to war between us and Spain. Would it surprise you to know that that's not how it happened? Would it surprise you to know that this was a false flag that was foisted on the American people through the assistance of the yellow press and a media that worked in concert with the government to get America involved in its first foreign war for imperialistic aims? Would it surprise you to know that this was a psyop against the American people to support a war that they initially didn't support? And would it surprise you to know that we know this because of uh, documents that were produced in the 70s from the CIA showing, pointing back to the Spanish-American War as one of their first early examples of how easy it is to fool the American people and how they've been doing it ever since. Wouldn't it be nice if we do it again? In other words, in their own words, they fooled the American people. In their own words, it was a psyop. In their own words, it was a false flag. And we bought it hook, line, and sinker. And because the method worked once, they used it again and again and again and again, and indeed are still trying to use it today. So that's why it's important to go back and find these early examples, because that was a template. That example formed a template that's been used ever since. And so that's one of the early examples that we will look at. The formation of this cabal, who it involved, why, to what ends. We'll be looking at the Rubicon moment, which, again, where treachery became treason. And we'll be looking at the templates, or hoping, if I do my job well enough, hoping to show you or demonstrate clearly what these templates are, what the patterns are, so that you, going forward, can re-examine more current events yourself, like in the 90s, the Oklahoma City bombing, or in the 2000s, 9/11, or in the 2000s, the war in Iraq and the intelligence assessment that Saddam Hussein had WMDs, which we found out later was not true. But it worked to get it. It was sufficient for the moment to get us involved in that war. Or how about the current situation in Ukraine? Or how about in the 2020s, the COVID pandemic? Or how about starting in 2015 and continuing to this very day, the Russia hoax? All of these you can be traced back. If you have this filter, you can trace them back and see the fingerprints of U.S. intelligence, the United States military, all over them. And it makes you question the narrative, the story, what you've been taught. I open these history books and I teach my students, and I'm required, because each state has standards, to teach the narrative. And the more I learn, the more I realize a lot of these narratives are wrong, or a lot of these narratives are purposely wrong. I am participating in the lie. I'm part of the lie. And so throughout my 30 years of teaching, I decided it's time to educate myself so that I can at least present to my students a balanced view and let them decide. Present the standard, present what really happened, and let them decide between the two. And that's what I hope to achieve with this channel. So this video is a way of introducing the channel. Treachery begets treason. I hope many of you will join me in this journey. I look forward to working through all of this material with you. And it won't be, it's not glamorous, and I don't have a lot of technical whiz bang basically it's me with a PowerPoint teaching. But like I said, I'll commit to keeping it short, 30 minutes or less. I hope that you will subscribe to my channel. I hope you'll smash the like button, as they say. I hope you'll share my channel and even comment in the comment section. And we will become a community going forward. Thank you, and God bless.